finally this semester we're getting into comprehension. So comprehension really ties all of everything we've talked about together. So how do we take all that priming research, all the semantics associations, word recognition, and really tie that together into a big picture? So comprehension is about how we take that integration of word identification, all that parsing that we've done, these thematic roles, semantics, and put it together into a giant picture of what's going on around us. So comprehension isn't limited to reading. Most of the research is on reading, but it also is how you process the world around you. So the next time that you're having a conversation with a friend at a table, think about all the different types of things that you're having to do to understand what's going on, especially in light of some of this research. So we're going to talk a little bit about models of comprehension, but also what is required for comprehension. So it's a constructive process. So it requires sort of a building of our understanding of what's going on. So do we take that and create these complex mental models, or are we lazy or efficient and build a model based on the minimal amount of work? So we've talked about minimal attachment, where people will add a word to the last parsing, so making it the easiest parsing possible. But do we do that for comprehension or not? And so what we do is called inferencing. Inferencing is taking the words on the page, the literal material, and inferring information that we already know about the world and putting it together into a model. There are lots of types of inferencing. We're going to cover some of them here. But it's the way that we create comprehension. So comprehension is like the name for the overall understanding of the world. Inferencing is the process. So it's the mental process that's running that creates an understanding. So just getting some basic definitions here. Text, anytime we talk about text, it is the literal printed written material, the sounds that you're hearing, the words that people are speaking. The story is a self-contained type of text. So if we think about reading, a story might be an individual storyline. Discourse is linguistic unit of several sentences. So discourse can be a paragraph, it can be an entire novel that contains several stories and a written text. So discourse is kind of the bigger picture. Whereas conversations can be written, but generally spoken interchanges where the topic might be changing. So there are different ways, different things that we are comprehending. It could be a story, it could be a science article, it could be talking to your mom on the phone. When we're processing this information, though, I've talked about semantics all semester, but semantic processing is required, so we're working out what those words and sentences mean. But then we also have a referential processing. So working out the role of those individual words and where the meaning fits in sort of the theme of what's going on. So we're working on how things refer to each other. When we're working on text processing, the material needs to be coherent. So this is for good text processing. It needs sort of a topic to be integrated into. If the text is jumping around all these different places, it's not coherent. You can't process it very well. So referential coherence is the sort of consistency in who is being referred to, so who or what we're talking about. So you'll see this when you're talking to your friends, you go, wait, what are we talking about? Because you've lost the referential coherence. Temporal coherence is consistency in timing of when something happened. So movies that sort of do flashbacks and flash forwards can get kind of confusing because you're not sure about the temporal coherence of what's going on. Locational coherence is where events are happening. Causal coherence is really important. We like things to be very causal. So murder mysteries are an example of things where you don't always get the causal coherence till the very end. But we do like consistency in why people are doing what they're doing. And so causal coherence can sort of make or break a text. And things are considered cohesive if all of those coherent pieces are working together, especially if they're referred to in successive sentences. So it's like this leads to this, which leads to this. So working with inferencing and memory, so one problem with inferencing is that you seem to think it is part of memory. What we're doing is pulling information from memory and combining it with the current events. And sometimes the difference between the actual text and the memories that we've added to it can be very confusing and cause problems. So Watergate is a great example. So there's a YouTube clip. It's just a clip of John Dean speaking about Watergate. And he wasn't able really to remember the events of Watergate, and more than half of what he said turned out to be inaccurate because we think he was trying to inference, well, this must have happened because I did this, sort of thing. So inferencing can be very bad, especially for eyewitness testimony. So generally, inferencing is a good thing for us. In the case of court cases, maybe not so much, but our representation of any kind of discourse or speech is really influenced by the inferences that we make. So inferences can be influenced by attitudes, by mood. I think you can see a lot of this going on right now in the way the media is portraying the political election. And so our inferencing of what happened in events is really influenced by the mood of the article or the words that they use. Maybe our feelings towards a particular candidate. So a lot of the way that you represent the information is influenced by these outside factors other than just the words on the page. And we always tend to represent information not as their individual words, but as the gist. So remember we were talking about constituent processing and parsing is once we hit the end of a clause, we really lose the rest of it. And when you hit a sentence, you are done with those words. So the individual words may not matter so much, but will represent the gist of what's happening. So I always ask people to tell me about their favorite book, and they give you a short synopsis of it, and I'm like, yeah, but what really happens in the book? Because they're representing that information as gist format, so any kind of summary is a gist. Okay. So at the end, what we're doing is basically we take those individual words and we dump them at the end of sentences and phrases. We won't remember them anymore. And one way they test this is they give participants the same basic sentence with different word orders. And then they show them those sentences and they say, which one did you see? And they can't really pick out the sentence that they saw, but they can pick out the sentence with the right meaning. So I don't remember which one of these it was, but it was one of these because this is what it meant. So we'll remember surface detail if it was more real, like a conversation rather than a lecture. And this list verse thing is the top 15 most misquoted films because people think they remember what those conversations were or those famous quotes, but they're actually incorrect. And so that's an example of surface detail that's misremembered because it seems like the gist-wise it doesn't match. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example. I think you've made a fundamental error in the study. I think there are two fundamental tasks in this study. So fundamental error is this phrase that people tend to remember better because of its sort of salient for that sentence. Another interesting thing that happens when we're doing inferencing is prior knowledge really influences our ability to create coherence in a text. And so if you can sort of pause here and read this paragraph, you'll see that it just doesn't make any damn sense. Like it's weird. They're talking about balloons and sound and strings. And so what is this text about? Well, what they did was they gave people this text either with the context. So there's a picture of the context. It'll make a lot more sense now that you have a picture to match these sentences to. They either gave it to them before, after, or none. And if we ask people to remember what the text says, so what happened in this story, if I gave them the context before, so the picture, people would remember what happened the best because they were able to integrate those sentences into this picture. If we gave them the context afterwards, you sort of have this aha moment, but you just can't, since you couldn't integrate while you were reading, memory is poor. And basically, if you had no context, memory is also poor. So context helps with comprehension. It really leads to better recall because we are able to better create these pictures through inferences. Another really famous Bradford and Johnson study on prior knowledge, and I used this one in my memory and cognition class as well, so if you want to pause here and read the paragraph, you may see, well, I see a typo, first of all, but you may figure out what it's about without any extra help, but most people don't. And what it's about is about washing clothes. And so if I gave you that context before, this whole thing makes sense. You don't have any problems reading it. If I give you the context afterwards, you sort of have this like, oh, okay. If I give you no context, you get those same results, that people have a real struggle in remembering the information. So the background knowledge of what's happening helps, and it'll help you understand what's applicable and how to integrate those things together. Okay. So here's another example of prior knowledge. And so it kind of starts off like kids are playing hooky, and then they go to this nice house, but there's a bunch of stuff at the house. Okay. If I gave you the title House Buying, what would people remember? And so they tend to remember that the house is old and that it has a leaky roof, because that's more important for house buying. So we're figuring out what information is applicable based on what prior knowledge we gave you. If I asked you about burglars, you're going to remember all the importance, the nice stuff that they had. So perspective is very important. It helps you look for what pieces of information are right or match what you're looking for. So the process of inferencing, we've been talking about how inferencing can affect what we're reading, but how do we actually inference now? So it allows us to take additional knowledge and facts that we already know and elaborate on information. So it's sort of the way we take background information and put it into the model of our text. So we gave people these paragraphs where we told them that Gerald Martin was a politician who was trying to basically be a dictator. Some people saw Gerald Martin, some people saw Adolf Hitler. If they saw Hitler, what information do you think that they remembered? So they would actually remember the dictator thing better, and then they would also add in inferences about Hitler that weren't actually part of the text. So they would remember things that they knew from prior knowledge, but hadn't actually seen in the text. And there's another version of this paragraph where they're talking about Helen Keller. Not being a dictator, but her life. So let's talk about the types of inferences. There are logical inferences, so it comes from the meaning of the text presented. So John is a bachelor, so we'll know that John is male. There are bridging inferences, sometimes called backwards inferences, where you relate new information to previous information that you know, and that's mostly through pronouns. So Bob went to the store, he bought milk, eggs, and cheese. If you ask someone who's he, it'll be Bob because he's the previous noun actor in the sentence. Sometimes these are called anaphoric inferences, where you're going backwards. Okay. Elaborative inferences extend what's in the text to real-world knowledge. But they do cause what's called a frame problem for our understanding of how people process text. So of all the information that I know about the world, how do I know which pieces are important? And so it's sort of difficult for us to predict what people are going to pull in for elaborative instances, because we can't predict the knowledge that they know from the world and the individual experience of the reader. Pragmatic inferences are inferences that aren't logical in their sense of like logical being, they come directly from the meaning of the words, but they're just more practical inferences about the way our understanding of the world works. And so these aren't necessarily deductive, sometimes they're just inductive, or it's likely true, but it's not totally possibly true given logics. So when do people make inferences? Generally, it's about the main character of a story and their goals. So causal inferencing is super important. Actions relating to the plot. So two kinds of views on this process. So the constructionist view is the idea that inferencing happens just sort of on a need-to-know basis. So your goal of processing is to just construct a picture. Minimalist view is we only really make bridging inferences, but keep the elaborative inferences as little as possible because it requires a lot more work. So one is that we construct this mental model of the world. One is that we read without doing too much extra work. So the research shows that people mostly use elaborative inferencing for memory of a text. So the way that we study this, that's paradigm, really biases us to think that we know more elaboration is happening. So what that first bullet really says is that the way that researchers look at this particular type of inferencing really leads us to believe that more elaboration is happening than maybe it is. But we also do bridging inferences as we're processing, otherwise we won't maintain coherence. So it's probably a little bit of both depending on the goals of the reader. So open discourse roles are bridging inferences to link to previous material. So if I said I drove to Memphis yesterday, the car kept overheating, drove really led me towards processing for car. And so when you have that sort of word like kick or drove that have very strong thematic goals, that will lead you to the next sentence. So you're expecting something to do with cars in the next sentence, or at least it isn't a surprise when it comes up. We think that there's a two-stage model to resolve these sort of open discourse issues. One's called bonding, so items are suggested by lexical context. I swear I fixed all these. Oh well. Items from drove suggest what's coming next, so cars, and then resolution. So a link between the filler and the verb is tested against context. So I drove and the car, those two match, so we would move on. It makes sense, it's coherent. Okay. All right, so here's an example of that sort of idea. The teacher was busy writing a letter of complaint to a parent, so that suggests that they're writing with a pen. This research is a little old, so maybe now it might suggest that they're typing. Okay. The teacher was busy writing an exercise on the board. That suggests chalk. So they either got one of those two sentences first, and then in the next sentence, what they see is she was disturbed by a loud scream at the back of the classroom, and either chalk or pen dropped to the floor. So what will happen is people will scan that second sentence all the way through and just kind of briefly go over chalk or pen. But then at the end of the sentence, they'll go back to that that open discourse role and look at it again, just to make sure it matches what they understood from the first sentence. If there's a mismatch between the two, or a mismatch, if instead the teacher was busy writing a letter of complaint to a parent and the word is chalk, they look at it much longer than if it's a match. So what we tend to do is we're integrating everything together, and then we're sort of checking to make sure that it matches context-wise. So some implications of inferencing and how susceptible it is to these different processes is eyewitness testimony. So Loftus is one of the most famous researchers in this area, and her car crash study is probably the most famous study. And so the link there is for a TED talk that she did where she talks about a lot of her research. But what they did was they showed people a fake car crash and then asked them leading questions like, did you see a broken headlight versus did you see the broken headlight? So the second sentence implies that there was one and maybe you missed it. Then another set of questions is how fast were they going when they hit each other versus how fast were they going when they smashed into each other. So smash implies a much faster speed. So the results from this were that did you see a broken headlight? People sort of split. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. There isn't one, I don't believe. Did you see the broken headlight? More people say yes than they should, because the implies that it is there. How fast were they going when they hit each other? They tend to make very low estimates because they're going very slow in the video. How fast were they going when they smashed into each other? They increase their estimates a lot. It's all from the same video. So clearly the wording of what we're doing, the framing of it, allows for different inferences. Later, when you ask people to just describe the event to you, and you gave them this, how fast were they going when they smashed, they'll add in that there was broken glass, because if two cars smash into each other, clearly some glass is going to break, even though it didn't actually happen in the study. So for referencing is a special type of inferencing. It allows us to figure out what things are referring to. So I put duh here because it seems silly to define reference, but it's what things refer to. A co-reference is two or more noun phrases with the same reference. And so pronouns, this is really our understanding of pronouns, and how we disambiguate which pronoun goes with which noun or which topic. So an antecedent is a linguistic expression that you have to sort of account for to determine who's the reference for. So it's if you have the pronoun Bob went to the store, he got milk, eggs, and cheese, it's Bob. Okay, so the antecedent came first. An anaphor is basically the pronoun. I don't know how to explain this very well. It's the pronoun in which is part of this linguistic expression where I have to have the reference. So if I said he went to the store, you would be like, who? So the he is sort of the anaphor. The antecedent is the actor in the sentence. So an anaphor or anaphoric resolution is that backwards inference that we use to maintain coherence. So when we hit that anaphor, the he, the pronoun, we go back in the text to figure out who it is that we're talking about or what it is that we're talking about. So anaphoric ambiguity is when we can't figure out which one is talking about. So Billy stuck a dagger in the corpse. It was made out of silver. So we have our referent here and then our anaphor here, but what is the it? Is it the dagger? Is it the corpse? More than likely it's the dagger, and people will make that inference because corpses aren't normally made of silver, so we're pulling in background information. And then it oozed blood. Again, another it. So is it the dagger? Is it the corpse? Is it the silver thing? And most people pick the corpse because corpses are supposed to ooze blood. So this is anaphoric ambiguity because there are three nouns that we could be referring to, and it's not clear which one it is at first. You have to make the inference, that jump, to be able to figure it out. So the ways that we do that are we really sort of cope. Now that may seem like a really easy sentence, so how did you know that that was correct? Sometimes called parallel function. It allows us to match our anaphor to our antecedent in the same relative position. So as actor or actee or act of the sentence. So Bob sold Dave his broomstick because he hated it. Bob sold Dave his broomstick because he needed it. So for he, here, they ask him, who is the he? Is it Bob or is it Dave? But he hated it is he is the actor in the sentence. So you assume that it's Bob because Bob sold Dave, so it's he is the first actor in the sentence. But in the second sentence, most people say that Dave needs it. So it's difficult to understand this process because of that, the differences in parallel function here. We will also cope by using gender, especially in gendered languages. So this depends on language, but he versus she, matching to our traditional understanding of naming in English. We also use verb type. So Bob sold his broomstick to Dave because he, so he is Bob. Bob blamed Dave because he, and in this sense, he would be Dave, because what you're doing now is disambiguating why the blame. And so it depends on the verb what you're matching the anaphor to. We also use causality. So Daniel apologized to Arnold because he had been behaving badly. So we'll use he here as Daniel. Daniel apologized to Arnold because he didn't deserve the criticism. He there is Arnold this time and not Dave. I'm sorry, Daniel, because of the causal inferencing in that sentence. We'll also use antecedents that are closer to the reference, like in the number of words, so we pick the closest noun. But the most common thing other than causality is the sort of background knowledge. So Bob sold his piglets to Dave because he had become a veterinarian. I'm sorry. That doesn't make any sense. Vegetarian. I can't even read my own slides. And so our understanding of vegetarian understands, okay, so we don't want to have these pigs anymore. We don't want to eat them. So we're going to sell them to someone else. So that's an elaborative inference. It requires several steps. Veterinarian. All right, so pronouns are faster. So our processing is faster when we are using the explicit focus of a sentence. So it's called foregrounding. Bob was driving to Memphis. He was tired. So he is the actor in the sentence. That's foregrounding. The implicit focus in the sentence is the car. It broke down. It becomes the second sentence. It becomes a harder sentence to process because of that implicit focus. So we never say that there was a car, but it's implied. And so the it broke down is processable, but it does take you a little bit longer because of that implied car, rather than having a sentence like he was tired, because that's in the foreground. It's important information. Okay, so coherence is determined by the order in which the information is given to us. So this sort of new contract idea is that the reader and the writer are giving you the information in the way that we can process it. So this is what makes stories that jump around between narratives a little more confusing, because there's sort of this promise that we're going to get information in a way that is processable for us to create a picture. So I know the first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I thought it was the worst book in existence because there are so many Miss Bennets. Why? Right? And I couldn't keep it coherent because they were always using the same pronoun, essentially, and the same name, and it didn't make sense. So books that are more coherent kind of always give you information in an order that you can assimilate it. It would make sense. And that takes us less time to understand new information when it contains the same idea, so when it flows better. So centering theory is this idea that each sentence or each utterance has a backwards looking center. So the center of it links to previous material back, and a forward looking center that offers links to new material forward. So whatever sentence we have, it refers to the last one. It helps tie it together to the last one. It also moves the text forward by telling you what's coming next. So it's kind of like those brief synopses that you get at the beginning of every TV show. So previously on, that gives you the backwards looking material, and forward looking materials like implying what's going to happen next week. So all that taken together is sort of inferencing the process and how we create these models. Now the real question becomes, what are the models that we're creating? This is where we're going to take a brief break and come back and do this in part 2.